Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of December 1st, and this is your Monday briefing. Congress is back for a 3-week work period. And as is the case around this time of year, there are a lot of questions about the possibility of legislation before the end of the year.
And joining us to answer some of those questions are Chairman Dave Camp and Karl Russo. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
So Chairman Camp, let me come to you first. Now that we're back from the Thanksgiving break, could you help us get our bearings on where things stand with tax policy right now and what we should expect or keep an eye on as we head through the few weeks remaining of 2025?
Well, thanks, Sindhu. That's right. There's only less than 2 weeks of legislative session days before the end of the year. And I think there's a lot of expectation with regard to tax policy that we'll see something with regard to the enhanced premium tax credits. They expire at the end of the year, and there's been a lot of certainly discussion of that during the government shutdown, and I think that issue still remains on the table. I often get asked also, will there be a reconciliation bill this year? And I think that's very, very unlikely, given that the short time frame that we have and the difficulty of putting a reconciliation bill together. Also, I think we'll continue to see guidance from Treasury on the OB3 bill between now and the end of the year. And just as we saw on the stock buyback tax, I think we may see something on some of the provisions in OB3 that are new, like the auto loan interest deductibility and some items of that nature. And then lastly, I think people are looking to see something from the OECD G7 agreement. There's been a lot of work on that this fall, and I think there's an expectation that there'll be some sort of announcement between now and the end of the year.
That in and of itself is a lot for the remaining time that we have. So let's turn to healthcare. It's been front and center and was an issue in the government funding debate. With the promised healthcare reform vote in mid-December approaching and lawmakers pressing for action on everything from premium subsidies to broader affordability measures, could you break down what's at stake and where tax might play a role?
Well, I think tax certainly has a very direct role in these enhanced ACA premium tax credits. And they're very expensive to extend, and they were really viewed as a provision that was important to have during the COVID pandemic. So there's a fundamental question of whether those should be extended, but also how. And there has been a handful of House and Senate members working on a bipartisan solution with regard to this, and it generally has revolved around sort of a short-term extension with some guardrails on income and income limits and other reforms potentially in the legislation. The administration, whether directly or inadvertently, floated sort of this sort of proposal, and it was really rejected pretty directly by House Republicans. In fact, the Speaker of the House actually telephoned the White House and said very few Republicans would be supporting that. But there is certainly a core of moderates in the House working with Democrats and a handful of senators, Republicans and Democrats, working on trying to find some sort of solution there. And so far, Senate Majority Leader Thune has promised a vote on this issue, and it's expected to occur the week of December 9th. And yet Speaker Johnson has signaled that the House is unlikely to look at that. So I think that we'll have to see where this plays out. At least right now, it appears, though, this vote in the Senate may have the parties going back to their corners, with Republicans rejecting, having their own alternative, and Democrats rejecting that, and then Democrats wanting to extend a full extension of those credits, and Republicans rejecting that. So at this point, it's unclear how this gets resolved, but it seems at least the discussions so far have been around some sort of 2-year extension with some guardrails around income limits.
Karl, if we could bring you into the conversation and continue with this theme of affordability, that was very much at front and center of recent off-year election results. I want to talk a little bit about what affordability might look like in terms of policy heading into 2026 and specifically next year's midterm elections.
Yeah, Scott. So I think a lot of the affordability concerns are due to sort of increased demand at the same time that supply is facing some restrictions. So if you think about something like housing, which is about a third of overall consumption, we've seen increases in demand because there's delay of marriage. And so you've got people demanding 2 households, and maybe in the past there would have been demand for only 1. You've seen increased life expectancy among seniors that's keeping them out of some of the group housing facilities and in their homes longer, which is also pushing up demand. At the same time, you have concerns about labor shortages, some of which have been exacerbated by immigration issues, as well as, I think, to combat some of that, you're seeing a push on interest rates, right, to encourage lower rates to try to help make housing more affordable. And so I think that's where a lot of the policy focus is going to be in the short term in 2026, because that's something that can flow through relatively quickly. If you think about on the healthcare side, insurance makes the whole price system in healthcare a little bit more opaque, and that can lead to sort of more demand for services at the same time that you don't have any more providers out there, and they can end up increasing in cost and that's one of the big driving factors in healthcare affordability is the increasing services costs and inflation more generally. And until you can see something on that front, you're unlikely to see some mitigation in those concerns. And so I think that's where you see a lot of the demand for the increased subsidies. But subsidies kind of cut both ways. They can alleviate a little bit of the short-term affordability issues, but at the same time, it can also exacerbate the demand issues because it brings more people into the system demanding more health services, and that can sort of go in the other direction and actually drive up costs a little bit. The last place where you see it kind of playing out, I think, in the policy space is on things like food and energy prices. Energy prices had been declining and holding down overall inflation. That's sort of stopped as they're now sort of flat. And on the food side of things, you've seen some effect of the tariffs. And I think the administration's recent changes to alleviate some of the tariffs on things that we don't produce in the United States, where some of the upward pressure on prices, coffee, bananas, those sorts of things, pulling back on those as an attempt to get at some of the affordability issues in a policy way in the short run.
That makes sense. Karl, if we could conclude on a question about trade, the Congressional Budget Office revised its outlook on how tariffs can affect the deficit. Could you talk a little bit about what's behind that shift in their projections? And also, what does it tell us about the economic impact of using tariffs for deficit reduction or to fund proposals like President Trump's tariff rebate checks idea?
Yeah, so the Congressional Budget Office revised their estimates of tariff revenue over the next 10 years, saying that they would reduce deficits instead of by $4 trillion, only by $3 trillion. And so that's a pretty significant change. Some of that is due to policy differences. So we negotiated lower tariff rates with China, the EU, and Japan under IEEPA. That has alleviated some of the pressure. At the same time that when you bring those base levels of revenue down, you also get less interest savings from that additional revenue, because we now got to go borrow some more money than we thought. And that's pushing in that direction as well. You've also seen some sort of not policy changes, but sort of analysis changes based on data that's come in. So it looks like more goods are qualifying for USMCA exemptions. And since Canada and Mexico are such a large portion of overall trade, that's pulled down that tariff revenue estimate a little bit as more qualify for exemptions there. You're also seeing less of the steel and aluminum content for derivative products, which is affecting the Section 232 tariff revenue and bringing that down, as well as some revisions in the methodology. And I think some of those are the more interesting ones, is it looks like CBO is giving more credit to the fact that foreign exporters might be absorbing some of the cost of these tariffs, which is something the administration has been harping on for a while. It's relatively modest in their assumptions, but it has significant changes that actually push up tariff revenue. If not all of the price increases are going through to consumers, but exporters are in the foreign countries are absorbing some of it, then you don't see a dramatic adjustment in the trade flows. And so you get the tariffs applying to more volume of imports and therefore bringing in more revenue. We haven't seen a ton of this in the data, but there are a couple of notable examples of companies where they've said in order to maintain market share in the United States, they are cutting their prices in order to maintain that.
And Karl, maybe one last question. Will we be seeing $2,000 checks from the government in our stockings this year?
Certainly not in our stockings this year. I think that if there is some effort to try to refund some of that tariff revenue, it's going to require, I think, congressional action in order to do that. If you were to refund all of the revenue, it would be somewhere on the order of magnitude of about $300 billion a year. For $2,000 checks, depending on the breadth of those, that would be about $600 billion a year. So there's not enough to cover ones of that magnitude. And I think to tie it back to the earlier affordability discussion, I think there is some wariness about injecting too much cash into the system and not to repeat the inflationary pressures that we saw as a result of that we experienced in 2020 and 2021 with some of the large stimulus that happened then. So I think we're not going to see them in our stockings in 2025 for sure. I'm a little agnostic about or uncertain about whether we'd see them even in 2026.
Sure, makes sense. Thank you so much, Karl. And Chairman Camp, thank you for your input as well. Always appreciate your insights. Thank you. And a note to our viewers to stay with Policy on Demand as we analyze year-end developments from Washington, starting with Week in Review, which returns on Friday.
And thank you, as always, for spending this time with us. Have a great week.